we're starting a new study today, and I'm really anxious about it. The book of Daniel is one of those seminal books, I think, of the Old Testament. And what I mean by that is it's the first book of apocalyptic material. It's one of the first books that actually begins to talk about God's redemptive plan going into the future, and future to the time of the people who actually received the book. We wouldn't be able to understand some of the material in Matthew and in Revelation without the book of Daniel. It is the most quoted book of the Old Testament in the New. And so it really sort of lays a great foundation for us, for our understanding of what God is doing for us presently, given what he was doing for them at that particular time. We're starting at Daniel chapter 1, and my real goal, my real heart is for you to sort of see how this book fits into the whole process of what God is doing for us in Christ Jesus. Daniel has been used so many times in this sort of trivial way. It's been used so many times because Daniel was probably a young teenager in an incredibly situation which probably caused him a lot of peer pressure. It's been used a lot to talk about teenagers and their ability to withstand peer pressure. I'll tell you right off the bat, that's a trivial way to look at the book of Daniel. I want us to see its eternal impact. And we have to sort of stay at a certain level then if we were to talk about levels of reading, down here at the lowest level is kind of the application level. This is where you sort of take a book. Y'all stay with me. I'm telling you, I'm going somewhere. So where you take a book and you try to find its modern day relevance. You try to get something out of it. Usually what you're looking for is encouragement. You're looking for a message, right? A nugget, if you will. You've probably even heard that language before. And then at the next level is sort of the expositional level. That's where you really sort of talk about what's going on in it, sort of get into the story. You know, it would be like I transported all of you through time and I put you back in say, the 7th century BC, and you sort of walk the streets of Babylon with Daniel and sort of turn and look around and survey the area. And then we talk about what would you kind of do if you were there. You kind of look at Daniel and say, okay, what he did here, you should do. What he didn't do here, you shouldn't do. That's at the level of sort of exposition. And then a level above that becomes sort of eternal. It becomes cross-cultural. It becomes across time. It becomes timeless. Is the level of theology. That's at the level of what is God doing as he communicates this to us as he wrote it. I want to stay at that level, if y'all will, because it's at that level that we find its real significance. You know, I could give y'all a trivial application, and I can tell you in times of peer pressure, hold out. Don't do what everybody else is doing. But listen, that's only going to get you so far. At this level of theology, what you're going to see is going to answer some deeply held questions if you were to reflect on it. Some important questions that are really fundamental for your faith and how you see God and how you respond to God in a changing world where reality will press in on your faith and make you doubt sort of this primitive ancient faith that we have. It'll sort of squeeze out your understanding about God and what he's doing. Cause you to sometimes live a double life. You know, you'll live this faith on Sunday and then you'll live in the real world the rest of the time. And this book of Daniel, you're going to see, is going to help you to bring the two of them together so that your faith can function in a real world. We're going to cover the first chapter because Daniel is one of those neat books where every move sort of falls right at the chapter divide, right? And in this first chapter, like any first chapter, it sets the tone for the rest of the book. That's just a given, right? So as we go through it, remember, we're just at the first chapter of what will become the whole book of Daniel. right? So the writer has some things to do. First, he's got to introduce you to the characters. Any literature that's going to tell a story has to introduce you to the characters without sort of jumping in and assuming you know who they are. But listen, as you read it then, don't get confused at the characterizations of it. When the writer is introducing characters, he hadn't gotten around to the story yet. Does that make sense? And I've told you, in any narrative, there is no story until there is tension. All right? So, but here's how the story begins to unfold. And it really falls into three moves in this first chapter. I want you to see them so that you get a big picture. I don't know about y'all, but I'm a big picture person. I'll get lost in the details if you don't survey the area for me first. And listen, I don't want you to get lost in the details. A whole lot of people get lost in the details of Daniel, and they start asking questions that the writer has no intention of answering. All right? So you got to stay at a big picture level so that you don't start to ask questions that the author is not interested in answering for you. Beginning at verse number 1 and 2, the writer is going to set it in a historical context for you. And listen, when he says it, he's writing it to the ancient Jewish believers, right, who are in the exile. And so it may not have a whole lot of significance for us, but it does bring meaning to the book. So you've got to get the historical context that he's trying to give you. So he sets it in a historical context, and in so doing, he gets at, for the Israelites, for the Jews at the time, their major theological concern. He's going to give you the theological context which brings for you the big problem that they have, right? And then he is going to show you how he's going to solve the big problem so that they can continue to have a tribal faith in a global world. And then he is going to tell you then, as a reader, the implications of how he worked it out for them. And y'all know, the writer is not simply writing a story. He's actually giving us a revelation of God. So at the end, we're going to say, I get it. I know my God better now. And if I can know my God better, the things that come into life that people want to call real world, don't shake your faith because you know him better. You know how your God functions in a real world. All right? So let's look at this first section here. I call it the God of Israel or the God of Babylon, because that's going to be the issue. Now, it says, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. Now, make sure y'all are with Daniel as he's writing it. Jehoiakim is one of the last kings of Judah that will exist in the Old Testament. He's not the last, right, because his son Jehoiachin is actually going to become king, although he doesn't have much authority to rule. He's sort of a vassal king, right? He's a king under the thumb of the king of Babylon. And so Jehoiakim is the last king in the land that we know. And it says, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and he besieged it. Now here's what y'all got to know, so that y'all can understand the book like a reader who first received the book would have read it. Things are changing in the world. There's been a major shift in the world at this time historically. We are moving from the tribal kings who conquer other tribal kings to big national powers. It's the first time historically that that's ever really happened. We've had one power on the scene. We've had lots of civilizations, but they were all governed by different tribal kings, right? We've seen the Sumerian culture rise up, but there were a whole bunch of different tribal kings within the Sumerian culture, right? We've seen Egypt as a great power, but Egypt pretty much stayed within its own borders. They just sort of came out to fight over their own interest. But at this time historically, we've seen the rise of one of the most powerful nations the world had ever known in the Assyrian nation, who were up in that northern area up above what is present-day Iraq. They swooped down and took the northern kingdom of Israel, right? They're conquering major portions of land, right? That for us, it's not uncommon to know what a world power is, but at that time, they didn't know such things. Listen, David and Solomon's great kingdoms comparatively were still pretty small. You know, when you read the books and you talk about people coming to see Solomon and his wisdom and all his riches, they didn't compare to Assyria and Babylon. I mean, you know, the land of Egypt is Israel was so very small, even at the height of its power, it was still so very small that Assyria came and it absorbed it and the rest of the world. And then after Assyria came the rise of Babylon. And just before Nebuchadnezzar seized Jerusalem, as the passage said, Egypt, which was a fledgling power at the time, had sided with Assyria because Babylon was growing so strong, and they had this great war just in a place called Carchemish, just north of Israel, and Babylon had just won the day. The whole world had just taken a major shift in power. I mean, folks all over the world are going, wow, something is happening down in Babylon. The whole world is changing. There's been a major shift in power. And that's where Israel found itself. And here's what you got to understand. Israel, Jehoiakim, has already given way because Egypt had already conquered Jerusalem, but they let Jehoiakim stay as king, but he wasn't really running anything. Right? In fact, King Pharaoh Necho had already taken his brother off the throne, and he put Jehoiakim on the throne. So Israel is losing sort of its autonomy, if you will. They're probably already struggling with their faith because, listen, the God who had always promised that he was God of the whole world was Israel's God, and yet Israel is being manipulated by all of these giant nations now. And they know they can't compete. And they're probably struggling with, okay, listen, is our God a tribal God, or is he really the one and only God? And it doesn't look like he is anymore because the world is changing, and it looks like, well, maybe our faith has been primitive. Maybe we need a more global faith. Maybe we need a better religion. A religion that takes modern realities into account. And yet there's some people in the nation who are still trying to hold on to their Abrahamic sort of a faith. Right? They're still trying to hold on. And so, but when Babylon conquered Assyria and Egypt, the two great powers on the earth at the time, you know, it became what England was for a while, where the sun never set on the English empire. I mean, it controlled, y'all got to imagine, it controlled the whole world. Superpower, if you will. And watch what Daniel addresses in verse 1 and 2. He said, but notice what Daniel says in verse number 2. There's going to be 3 times in this first chapter where you read not just the historical accounts, but the divine intervention into history. The first one is here in verse 2. It says, the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. Now, first of all, y'all got let's be honest. Let's be real believers in Christ. Right? You know, one of the things I can't stand is fake Christians, right? Who give sort of a fake bravado as if the scriptures don't give obvious tension. Listen, when Nebuchadnezzar overruns it, it'd be real easy to say, well, no, the Lord gave him into his hand. It'd be real easy for me to do that, but I can see some other folk going, yeah, right. He couldn't do anything about it. Your God didn't show up on battle day. Maybe you need to rethink your God. Maybe you don't need to, in retrospect, kind of say, well, you know, God is really in control of that too. But the writer of Daniel gives this to his readers. He says, the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. It says, along with some of the vessels of the house of God And watch how the writer writes this. And he brought them to the land of Shinar. It's interesting that he would give that ancient name for the first great rebellion in the Old Testament. Y'all remember where Shinar was? Shinar was where they built the Tower of Babel. The first great humankind rebellion. Y'all remember? Where they wanted to stay together and build a tower that would reach heaven instead of spreading out and filling the earth like God had asked them to. So watch this. Daniel knows what the Jew is thinking. Wait a minute. Nebuchadnezzar has come in. He has taken the holy city, and he's taken all of the holy instruments out of the temple, and he took it back to the place of the great rebellion. Listen, it sounds like our God has lost, doesn't it? This is 605 BC. This is 605 BC. All right? And then he says, and he says he brought those vessels to the house of his God. Y'all see it? And he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. Because here's what the writer of Daniel knows. What he knows is when they went into exile, when Israel lost, when Jerusalem was destroyed, he knew what could potentially be destroyed was the faith of the people. We have always built our faith on the fact that God gave us this land and said he would preserve us in it, despite how big the nations around us got. We are God's nation, and we're not going anywhere. And when the walls of Jerusalem came down, a whole lot of their faith did too. And the writer of Daniel knows it, and he says, yes, you got a problem, don't you, Israel? Listen, the vessels of your God is now in the house of his God. Now, what you gonna do with your faith now? The world has just changed, and it has forced you to re-examine your infantile faith, is what he says. And here's why. Here's why. This is going to be a great lesson for all of the believers in the world today. Here's what Israel's infantile faith said. We've got God, and so we're going to always prosper. We're going to be all right. We can do whatever we want to do, whether we worship him in spirit or truth or not. We are good people. We're going to be all right. God is going to always bless us. And then when the walls came down, they said, wait a minute. We got to rethink that faith then, don't we? You know, listen. We live in a changing world. And listen, our faith gets tested all the time. Let me give you an example. Listen, we thought this was a Christian nation, and we thought we'd never see the day where there'd be same-sex marriage in this country. And then when it happened, some Christians had to change what they believed, didn't they? You better believe they did. We had to re-examine our faith now. Now, watch this. So, Daniel gets at the heart of what's bugging them. He says deliberately, the things of your God is now in the house of his God. But listen, you need to know, it was God who gave you into his hands, and he knows they're probably struggling with it because, listen, that's not how we think. That's not been our faith. Our God doesn't give us into anybody else's hands. And listen, when I read it, my first struggle was, okay, I don't want to believe a fool's gold faith either. I don't want to look back at history and be blind to the reality that, listen, God, my God had always worked in this little bitty nation, and when realities changed, we had to start thinking differently. I didn't want a justifiable faith. I wanted it to be authentic. And here's the only thing that I could settle on that brought me any peace. Listen, watch this. The writings of the book of Moses, which was historically written long before this happened or was written. Y'all say it with me, this is important. The same God that we worshiped and that Israel worshiped told the nation in its infancy, if you break my covenant, I will bring a nation who will consume you. He said that. So that when it happened, it's not simply the reality of the world changing. I can look historically. Watch this. Not that he said it at the same time. He said it generations before. Listen, the same God of Israel. In other words, their faith wasn't in his word anyway. Their faith was in who they wanted him to be. Their faith is in what they thought he would do and not what he said he would do. See, our tendency is to reevaluate God, to redefine him according to what we want him to be. And we forget he has already spoken through his word who he is and what he will do. And sometimes we'll say, well, you know, I've loved this, right? I've had to counsel people, and I'll tell people, well, you know, the word of God says this. And then they'll say, but that can't be true because I know my God doesn't want me to be. They're reshaping God in their own image. Listen, he already told you what he would do. Just because you don't like what he would do doesn't mean you get to say that's not him. That's why we have all, as a community of faith, agreed that this is a revelation of him. Listen, if he told the nation generations ago, if you break my covenant, I'm going to send a nation to consume you. When it happened, why do you have a faith problem? But that's still an issue on the table. Watch this. Here's the next section from verse 3 through 16. I call it big faith in small hands. Big faith in small hands. So how is God then going to fix this problem? How is he going to preserve the promises he made to Abraham and the promises he made to David in this changing time where world powers have consumed little bitty Israel, little bitty Judah? How is he going to get this grand plan of kingdom and enduring kingdom with somebody on David's throne? How is that going to come to fruition? Because it never again looks like Israel, well, in its little bitty infant nation, small nation, is ever going to rise to become world power again. Where everybody recognizes that that's God's nation. It's been consumed. The walls are down. Temple is destroyed. How's he going to do it? Now, this is where it's a revelation of God. You're going to know your God better. Watch this. He's going to entrust the faith to certain people who are living in that changing world. Watch this. He introduces us to them in verse number 3. He's going to give us the setting in verse 3. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of his officials, to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles, youths in whom was no defect. See, that's how we know that Daniel and his three friends were probably teenagers. That's the word for youth here. They're not adults, they're still children. Watch this. Who were good looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, and who had ability for serving in the king's court. And he ordered them to teach them the writings or the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. Y'all see what he had? Now Alexander the Great followed a lot of this same precedent. When he came in to conquer a nation, instead of leaving the nobles and the royal family to sort of conspire against him, he incorporated them into his government. Right? He took the best and the brightest, because those are usually the most dangerous. You know, the knucklehead criminal is really no danger to the government. You know, that dumb criminal, he's really no threat. But it is the smartest and the brightest who are usually a threat. And so he incorporates them into his government. He wants them to be a part of his royal court. And listen, it's a wise thing to do because it appeases them. He's taken their children, right? He's taken their children, their future, and he is going to appease them with good stuff. Watch this. The king appointed for them a daily ration from the king's choice food and from the wine which he drank. Y'all see it? This is for them modernization. I mean, they're in the big city now. Israel had nothing like what they saw when they got to Babylon, and he's going to appease all of the royal youth of the day. Watch what happens. Writer is still building the case. Remember, there's no story yet till there's tension, and there is none yet, right? Watch this. And he said, and he appointed that they should be educated 3 years, and at the end of which they were to enter the king's personal service. Now among them from the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Then the commander of the officials assigned new names to them, and to Daniel he gave the name, assigned the name Belteshazzar. To Hananiah he gave the name Shadrach, and to Mishael he gave the name Meshach. And to Azariah, he gave the name Abednego. Now, for an English reader, we don't quite see what just happened. Watch this. Daniel and his 3 friends, their names all have the name of Israel's God in their name. The official for Babylon changes their name, and all 4 names have the names of Babylonian gods in their name. So what's still at issue? Whose God now is really God? Watch this. So now there is tension that just begins to be introduced, and we got to talk about how to take verse number 8, because so many people take it way too far. Watch verse number 8. But Daniel made up his mind, or quite literally, he set his heart that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank. Y'all see it? Daniel seems to have led him and his friends in this endeavor. Watch this. Now, some people have made more out of that than they should, right? They made this at the level of application and not at the level of theology. Listen, this is not about a teenager deciding to withstand peer pressure. That's not what this is. This is about a teenager determining to hold on to his faith as the world around him changes. Watch this. Because it wasn't simply that he didn't want to indulge in what everyone else was doing. The writer says he didn't want to defile himself, which is a ceremonially clean idea. Israel had always, a part of their faith, said, because we worship God, there's certain things according to his covenant we don't eat. And that when we eat, it's an act of unbelief in our God, which results in sin and uncleanness. And so what he said is, I'm not going to jeopardize my faith with the king's food. Are y'all with me? So he made up his mind that he's going to hold on to his faith. As the world around him changed, he says, I'm going to be faithful. I don't understand what's happening, and I don't know what the consequences are going to be, but I'm going to remain faithful. Now, y'all need to realize something. That's probably a childlike faith. You know, the average adult would probably be rethinking this situation. Okay, now how should I handle this? We're not in the homeland anymore. I probably can't even go to the temple anymore. So maybe the services are all out. Maybe the ceremonial cleanness and uncleanness is out too. Maybe it's okay to eat the food. You know, rationalizing. But in the way that a child would do, he says, no, I'm going to be faithful. I'm going to hang on to my faith. Which is probably a foolish thing to do, given the fact that his whole culture and world and religious system has gone already. But watch what happened. So he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. And then here is that second time where God intervenes into history. Only 2 times in the first chapter. Watch what it says. Now God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials. Y'all see it? So watch this. Watch this. We're going to have to deal with a fundamental theological question where people always mess it up. Is God responding to Daniel's obedience by granting the commander favor? Granting him favor with the commander? That's what some people will say. And some people then will reduce this down to the level of application. Here's what they'll say. If you're faithful, God will bless you. That's what they're going to say. Now listen, I know that can't be true because later in the book they're going to be faithful and they're going to get in trouble for it. That can't be the message. You know, later on they're going to be faithful and get thrown into the fire. Later they're going to be faithful and get thrown into the lion's den. That can't be the message. It's got to be bigger than that, right? You can't say definitively, if I'm faithful, God is going to bless me. It's going to turn out good. Not at least in the immediate circumstances. But watch this. Now God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander is written sort of as a historical note. It doesn't say as a result of his faith God granted. It writes it as if, now don't take the now as a temporal now. It's not like at that moment in time God granted. That now is a transition in thought to let you know what has happened, and he says he granted past tense. So in other words, God had moved to help the young man with his faith, as if God has a plan for his faith in the circumstances that he finds himself in. Are y'all with me? Listen, we don't want to be infantile and say, listen, if you decide you're going to hold yourself right, God is going to bless you. He's going to respond to your faith. No, God is already at work in preserving the faith. Because listen, it's not as simple as Daniel's faith anyway. He's got redemptive promises he's got to keep. He's got historical promises that go all the way back to Abraham that he has to preserve. He's simply acting through for youth who find themselves in a changing world. He's preserving his own redemptive plan. There's got to be a remnant that comes out, and God is already at work preserving the remnant. But I want y'all to see how he's doing it. You know, there was a time where God would show up and fight their battles and do all those things. He has just taken sort of a behind-the-scenes approach. Do y'all see it? He's very subtly changing hearts and working within the history that's happening. Y'all see it? Which he ordained in the first place. Listen, the miracles become a whole lot more subtle. You actually have to have the eyes of faith to see that it is one. Yeah, exactly. He has said, listen, I would have been your God, and I would have fought mightily with great miracles the way I brought you out of Egypt if you had remained faithful. But because you didn't, I'm going to have to work with my few to preserve it. And listen, no more grandstanding for you. You had that already. This is a great lesson. It's a great lesson for us. You know, I get so tired of the cliche, when God shows up, he shows out. You know, you can't build your faith on cliches. He doesn't. First of all, he doesn't have to show up. He's already there. And he doesn't have to actually do anything. He's already set some things in motion. And he's generally not showing off. He usually hides his hand and asks those who are faithful, if you have ears to hear, then hear. If you trust in me, it's going to work out. You may not see it. I won't show out. But I will work on your behalf. His grace is sufficient, but generally only in hindsight. Now, watch this. It says, I'm at verse number 10, and the commander of the officials said to Daniel, watch this, God has already granted Daniel favor, but listen, Daniel still has to continue to be faithful because the commander still doesn't right away say, okay, no problem. Watch this. The commander of the official said to Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has appointed your food and your drink. For why should he see your faces looking more haggard than the youths who are your own age? Then you would make me forfeit my head to the king. Y'all see the problem? He said, if that happens, then the king's going to say, what happened to their food? And off with my head. Verse number 11, but Daniel said to the overseer, whom the commander of the officials had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days, and let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be observed in your presence, and the appearance of the youths who are eating the king's choice food, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them. Why would he listen? Because God had granted him favor. You'll see how the Lord is working? It wasn't like the Lord had come to this man and scared him into being obedient to Daniel and none of those. The way that it worked out was he said, let me make a suggestion to you. And because God had given him favor, he listened. Watch this. So he listened to him in this matter, and he tested them for 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, their appearance seemed better, and that they were fatter than all the youths who had been eating the king's choice food. What just happened? Now, let me watch this. Here is how we trivialize it. We bring it down to level application. And some people, I've heard it, I promise you I've heard it, they will teach the need to abstain from meat, from this passage. They say you can be healthier if you just eat vegetables. Listen, is that the point? I don't care how bad the meat is for you. I don't care how hard it is to digest. You will be fatter you eat meat. Am I right? So what's just happened? Vegetables and water, and they are fatter than the folks who are eating meat and wine. What just happened? God is somehow moving. But do y'all see how subtle it is? You actually have to have eyes of faith to see it, don't you? I promise you this. I read a commentary in preparation for it that suggested that you can be healthier and have a healthier appearance, and the word says so because Daniel and his 4 friends were healthier in appearance than those who were eating meat and wine. Is that the point? It's not the point, is it? So the overseer continued to withhold their choice food and the wine they were to drink, and he kept giving them vegetables. Now, we've been through 2 moves in the passage where he set the scene historically, and he gave us the theological conundrum that Israel found itself in. Whose God is bigger? Right? Has our little bitty tribal God been consumed by the superpower? And then we see how God has determined he's going to work through the faith, the simple faith of those who find themselves in a changing world. Now watch the implications. My note in this one is, through our faith, we play a part in God's great plan. Watch this. Listen to how the writer ends the chapter. As for these 4 youths, and here's the 3rd time, and you're going to see God do something. God gave them knowledge and intelligence in every branch of literature and wisdom. Daniel even understood all kinds of visions and dreams. Y'all see that? Now, 3 times God intervened. He gave Jehoiakim into their hands, into Nebuchadnezzar's hands. That one was hard enough to believe, right? Historically, it's hard enough to believe that one. But watch this. When God gives Daniel favor, it's going to work itself out to an end that will be favorable, not necessarily for Daniel, but for God's plan. And then God gives all 4 of them intelligence and knowledge of every branch of literature and wisdom, because they're in this royal academy, if you will, with all of the rest of these youths who are probably not just Jewish, but from all of the rest of the nations that's been conquered. And watch this. But God gives them the ability to rise above their classmates. Y'all see it? Now listen. It's where it gets trivial. Application again. Does God give us wisdom to become good in school because we want to be good in school? So that we can bless God for having good grades? Come on, America. I know we think that. All across our country, we think that we're praying for our children. Why? So they can have good grades in school. Why? So they can have good grades in school. So they can be smart. Why does God give them that knowledge and wisdom to rise above those in the Royal Academy? He's got a plan. And the rest of the plan will unfold in the book of Daniel. What he gives them, he will use in them later to preserve the faith of Abraham. That would get them all the way through. Watch this, and you're going to see this. Y'all are gonna, when the light comes on, I promise you it's going to be an aha moment. That would take them from Nebuchadnezzar at the gates of Jerusalem to the people going back to the land. Watch this. Let me show it to you. Then at the end of the days, I'm reading at verse 18, at the end of the days which the king had specified for presenting them, the commander of the officials presented them before Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and out of them all, not one was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Why is that? Because God had given it to them to know those things. Don't miss that. It wasn't because they rose to the top on their own initiative. God had given them the ability, but the question, it still is on the table. Why? Watch this. So they entered the king's personal service. As for every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king consulted them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and conjurers who were in his realm. Y'all see what just happened? Watch this. 4 youth who determined they're going to keep their ancient faith by God's hand has just risen to the place where they have the king's ear, and the king trusts them more than anybody else in his realm. Not for personal success. Watch this. And look how I love the way the writer of the book of Daniel ends the chapter. Watch this. And Daniel continued until the first year of Cyrus the king. Y'all don't get it yet, right? Because y'all don't know the rest of the story. Watch this. It would be King Cyrus who would issue the decree that all of Israel could return to the promised land. So watch this. The writer has set up in the first chapter how God would get the faith of Abraham from the fall of Jerusalem to the return to the land. How would he do it? Through the faith of some who continue to be faithful as the world changes. And for what reason? To preserve his redemptive plan. So here's what it says to you and me. Here's where it becomes theologically appropriate for you and me. All you have to do is remain faithful to God, and you play a part in what he's doing throughout redemptive history. It doesn't mean that your faith will work out for your good personally. What it says is your faith allows you to participate in what God is doing. Listen, the Bible is very clear. Sometimes the faithful benefit and become successful and wealthy, and sometimes the faithful, because they are faithful, end up in poverty and in suffering. All of it is dependent upon God's choice for that faithful person. But both of them participate in what he's doing in his redemptive plan. So what we're going to see in the rest of the book is how God will preserve the faith of Abraham. Listen, what does it mean for you and me then? In a changing world, how do I keep such a primitive faith? How does God preserve my faith? In a world like we live in today, where science is proving, or so they think, proving our faith wrong regularly. How do I have faith at a time like that? I think it's the same way that Daniel did. Determined to keep your faith. Make up your mind you're going to keep your faith. And then God will work in all of those ways and unseen things that he does, where he intervenes in history, not with miracles, but with those subtle ways to preserve your faith, not because your faith is yours, but because your faith works in his plan. Because he has a plan that will come to fruition at the end of time, and somehow you have been given faith, you have been found faithful for just that time. You never know how your faith is going to encourage someone else's faith, and you don't know what he's doing, you just know he's got a plan. And you have the benefit of participating in it.